Jake Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stepped back to admire his work. 3 years ago, this place had been nothing but overgrown weeds and a rundown shack. Now his 15-acre ranch stretched out before him like something from a dream. The old farmhouse gleamed white in the morning sun. Its porch wrapped around two sides where he could sit and watch the sunrise with his coffee. The sound of horses snorting and stomping in the nearby pasture made him smile. Rex and Thunder, his two quarter horses, were getting restless for their morning ride. But first, Jake had work to finish in his workshop. The massive metal building housed his pride and joy, a custom motorcycle repair business that had grown from a hobby into something that actually paid the bills. Inside the workshop, 5 motorcycles in various stages of repair lined the concrete floor. Jake ran his fingers along the fuel tank of a 1967 Harley-Davidson that belonged to old Pete from town. The paint job would take another week, but it was going to be beautiful. Deep blue with silver flames, just like Pete had dreamed about since he was 20 years old. Jake had learned to work on bikes during his time in the Marines. 12 years of service had taught him discipline, hard work, and how to fix just about anything with an engine. When he came back home, the skills translated perfectly to civilian life. Word spread quickly in Cedar Valley about the Marine who could make any motorcycle purr like a kitten. The best part of his new life wasn't the business, though. It was the peace. No traffic jams on the way to work. No angry neighbors complaining about noise. No homeowners association telling him what color he could paint his fence or where he could park his truck. Jake had lived in Sunny Meadows subdivision for 2 years after coming home from overseas, and those HOA people had made his life miserable. Every week it was something new. His grass was half an inch too long. His mailbox was the wrong shade of black. His motorcycle was parked in the driveway instead of the garage. They even tried to fine him for hanging an American flag on his porch without getting permission first. The final straw came when they told him he couldn't have friends over for barbecues because it created too much noise and too many cars in the neighborhood. That's when Jake started looking for land outside the city limits. He wanted space to breathe, space to work, and space for his brotherhood to gather without someone calling the cops over every little thing. The Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club had been his family since he got back from deployment. These weren't the kind of bikers that people saw in movies. They were teachers, mechanics, construction workers, and small business owners who happened to love riding motorcycles together. Most of them were veterans, too. Guys who understood what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself. Every other weekend, the club would gather at Jake's ranch for their meetings. They'd work on bikes together, share stories, and plan charity rides for local causes. Last month, they'd raised $3,000 for the Children's Hospital by organizing a poker run that brought riders from 3 counties. The month before, they'd spent a Saturday building a wheelchair ramp for Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had come home from Vietnam in rough shape. Jake's role as sergeant-at-arms meant he helped keep order during meetings and made sure everyone followed the club rules. It wasn't a complicated job since the Iron Eagles were good people who looked out for each other. The hardest part was usually deciding where to order pizza from when meetings ran late. The ranch sat just outside the Willowbrook Estates development, where houses cost more than most people made in 5 years. From his back porch, Jake could see the perfectly manicured lawns and identical driveways of the subdivision. Sometimes he felt sorry for those people, living in their expensive boxes with no room to spread out or make any noise. His workshop sat about 100 yards from the house, positioned so the noise wouldn't bother anyone, and the smell of paint and oil stayed outside. Solar panels on the roof powered most of his equipment, and a small apartment above the main floor gave visiting club members a place to crash if they'd been drinking, or if weather made riding dangerous. The horses had their own pasture and a small barn that Jake had rebuilt from the ground up. Rex was getting older but still loved to run, while Thunder was young and full of energy. Jake rode them both regularly, sometimes taking long trips across the neighboring state land where he could think and remember what it felt like to be truly free. Money had been tight those first 2 years. The land cost most of his savings, and building the workshop had required a loan that made him nervous every month. But now the business was steady enough to pay all the bills and even save a little. Jake was proud that he'd built something real with his own hands, something that couldn't be taken away by some bureaucrat with a clipboard and a bad attitude. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile away, an old farmer named Bill who raised cattle and minded his own business. They'd wave when they saw each other, and sometimes Bill would stop by to buy Jake a beer and complain about the weather or the government. Bill had been farming the same land for 40 years and understood what it meant to work hard for what you owned. Behind the house, Jake had built a fire pit surrounded by log benches where the club gathered on cool evenings. Some of the best conversations of his life had happened around that fire, with good friends and cold beer under more stars than you could ever see in the city. These were the moments that made all the hard work worth it. In the evenings after work, Jake would often sit on his porch with Rex and Thunder grazing nearby, watching the sun set over his land. The silence was something he'd never gotten used to in the suburbs. Out here, the only sounds were wind in the trees, horses moving around, and the occasional coyote singing in the distance. Sometimes club members would call just to talk, knowing that Jake's place was open to anyone who needed a friend or a quiet place to think. The spare bedroom had hosted more than one brother going through a divorce or job loss, and the workshop had seen countless late-night therapy sessions disguised as motorcycle maintenance. Jake had no idea that his peaceful life was about to be turned upside down by people who believed they had the right to control what happened on his own land. He'd escaped the suburbs and their ridiculous rules, or so he thought. Some battles he was about to learn followed you no matter how far you ran from them. For now, though, life was good. The morning was beautiful, the horses were healthy, and 3 new customers had called yesterday about custom paint jobs. Jake Thompson had found his piece of the American dream, and he planned to defend it with everything he had. Life on the ranch stayed peaceful for about 6 months after Jake finished building his workshop. Then the letters started coming. The first one arrived on a Tuesday in March, delivered by a fancy courier service instead of regular mail. Jake almost threw it away, thinking it was some kind of sales pitch. The envelope was thick and expensive looking, with Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association printed in gold letters across the top. Inside the letter was 3 pages of legal language that basically said Jake's property now fell under HOA jurisdiction due to something called municipal boundary adjustments. Jake read it twice and still didn't understand half of what it meant. The important part was clear enough, though. Someone thought they could tell him what to do with his own land. Jake called his buddy Tony, who worked at the county courthouse, to ask what was going on. Tony explained that the Willowbrook Estates HOA had lobbied the city council to expand their boundaries. They claimed it was for improved municipal services and community standards. What it really meant was that several properties outside the original development were now subject to HOA rules and fees. They can't do that, Jake said into the phone, standing in his kitchen and looking out at his horses. I bought this place specifically to get away from HOA nonsense. Tony's voice was apologetic. They had a vote, Jake. It was in the legal notices section of the newspaper for 3 weeks. Since nobody showed up to object, it passed automatically. I'm sorry, man. I didn't even know about it until after it happened. The second letter arrived a week later. This one was shorter and much more direct. Jake's workshop was considered an unsightly commercial structure that violated community appearance standards. His motorcycles parked outside were inappropriate vehicles that needed to be kept in an enclosed garage. The horses were creating agricultural odors that neighboring residents found offensive. Jake laughed out loud reading that last part. His horses were a quarter-mile from the nearest house in Willowbrook Estates, and the wind usually blew away from the subdivision anyway. Someone would have to work pretty hard to smell anything from his property. The third letter came with photos. Someone had been driving by Jake's ranch and taking pictures of everything they thought was wrong. His American flag was too big. His mailbox was the wrong style. The gravel in his driveway created dust pollution when vehicles drove on it. Even his workshop's metal siding was apparently the wrong color for the community aesthetic. That's when Jake decided to drive over to Willowbrook Estates and see exactly who was causing all this trouble. The HOA office was located in a fancy building near the entrance to the subdivision. Inside, everything was white marble and gold trim, like a bank designed to intimidate people. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, looked at Jake like he'd tracked mud on her clean floors. I'd like to speak to whoever is in charge, Jake said politely. I'm getting letters about my property and I have some questions. The receptionist's smile was colder than a Montana winter. Mrs. Whitmore is our association president. She's very busy, but I can schedule an appointment for next month. Next month? Jake kept his voice calm, but his hands were clenched at his sides. This is about my home. I think that makes it pretty urgent. 20 minutes later, Jake was sitting across from Margaret Whitmore in an office that probably cost more to decorate than most people made in a year. Mrs. Whitmore was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back tight and a business suit that screamed money and authority. She looked at Jake like he was something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe. "Mr. Thompson," she said, not bothering with small talk, "your property is now part of our community, which means it needs to meet our standards. We've identified several violations that need immediate attention." Jake pulled out the letters he'd received. "Ma'am, with respect, I bought my land specifically because it wasn't part of any HOA. I moved out there to get away from rules like these." Mrs. Whitmore's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I understand your frustration, but the law is the law. The municipal expansion was voted on and approved through proper channels. Your property is now subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions, just like every other home in Willowbrook Estates." "But my property isn't in Willowbrook Estates," Jake said. "I'm outside the original boundaries." "The boundaries have been adjusted for the good of the entire community," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "Property values in this area are among the highest in the county, and we intend to keep them that way. Your business activities and lifestyle choices are incompatible with our community standards." Jake felt his temper rising, but forced himself to stay calm. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Mrs. Whitmore slid a folder across her desk. "This outlines the necessary changes. Your workshop needs to be relocated or enclosed in a way that's not visible from any public road. All motorcycles must be stored inside at all times. The horses need to be relocated to a proper agricultural zone. Your driveway needs to be paved, and your mailbox needs to be replaced with an approved model." Jake opened the folder and looked at the estimated costs. Relocating his workshop alone would cost more than $30,000. Paving his quarter-mile driveway would be another $15,000. The approved mailboxes started at $800 each. "This is ridiculous," Jake said. "You're talking about $50,000 in changes to property I own free and clear. The alternative is daily fines until the violations are corrected," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Starting at $100 per day per violation. I count at least 7 major violations on your property right now." Jake did the math in his head. $700 a day meant more than $4,000 a week in fines. Even if he could afford to fight this in court, the fines would bankrupt him long before any judge heard his case. "You people are unbelievable," Jake said, standing up. "I served my country for 12 years and I come home to this. Someone thinks they can steal my property rights because they don't like how my workshop looks?" Mrs. Whitmore's expression didn't change. "No one is stealing anything, Mr. Thompson. We're simply maintaining community standards that protect everyone's property values. You have 30 days to begin correcting the violations." Jake left the HOA office feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. The drive home gave him time to think, but thinking just made him angrier. He'd worked his whole adult life to own a piece of land where nobody could tell him what to do, and now some HOA was trying to take it all away. That evening, Jake called Big Tom Martinez, president of the Iron Eagles. Tom listened without interrupting as Jake explained what had happened. "They can't just expand their jurisdiction like that," Tom said when Jake finished. "There has to be some kind of legal process, some way to fight it." "Tony at the courthouse says it was all legal," Jake replied. "They published notices and held a vote. Since nobody objected, it went through automatically." "We need to get you a lawyer," Tom said. "This smells like corruption to me. Rich people trying to push around anyone who doesn't fit their idea of what a neighborhood should look like." Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment got worse. HOA security cars started driving past Jake's property multiple times a day, sometimes stopping to take pictures. They documented every truck that came to deliver supplies, every friend who stopped by to visit, every time Jake worked late in his shop with the lights on. The violation notices kept coming too. Now they were complaining about the color of his workshop doors, the height of his grass, and the fact that his horses were visible from the road. They even tried to fine him for the American flag on his porch, claiming it was too large for residential display. Jake started losing sleep, wondering if these people would eventually force him to sell his ranch and move somewhere else. He'd already escaped one HOA neighborhood, and the thought of having to do it again made him sick to his stomach. The final straw came when Mrs. Whitmore herself showed up at his gate one morning, accompanied by 2 security guards and a man with a camera. They didn't come onto his property, but they stood on the public road taking pictures and pointing at different buildings. Jake walked down to the gate to see what they wanted. "We're conducting a comprehensive violation assessment," Mrs. Whitmore announced. "You'll receive a full report within 48 hours. "Get away from my property," Jake said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore smiled that same cold smile he'd seen in her office. "We're on a public road, Mr. Thompson. We have every right to be here." That night, Jake called an emergency meeting of the Iron Eagles. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Tuesday morning started like any other day on the ranch. Jake fed Rex and Thunder their breakfast oats, checked the water levels in their trough, and spent an hour working on Pete's Harley before heading into town for supplies. He needed paint for a custom job, some specialty bolts for another bike, and groceries for the week. The drive to Cedar Valley took about 20 minutes on the winding country road that connected his ranch to civilization. Jake loved this drive, especially in the morning when the sun was still low and the shadows were long across the fields. It reminded him why he'd chosen this life over the cramped suburbs where every day felt exactly like the last one. At Murphy's Hardware, Old Man Murphy himself helped Jake load 5 gallons of automotive paint into his truck. They talked about the weather, the upcoming charity ride the Iron Eagles were organizing, and Murphy's grandson who was thinking about joining the Marines after high school. "Tell him to come by the ranch sometime," Jake said as he paid for the paint. "I'll give him the real story about military life, not the recruiting poster version." Murphy laughed. He could use some straight talk from someone who's been there. These kids think it's all like the video games. Jake's next stop was Patterson's Auto Parts, where he picked up the specialty bolts and some new tools he'd been wanting. Patterson was a Vietnam veteran who understood the value of quality equipment and fair prices. They spent a few minutes discussing a restoration project Patterson was working on in his spare time. The grocery store was Jake's least favorite part of any town trip. Too many people, too much noise, and too many choices for simple things like breakfast cereal. He grabbed what he needed as quickly as possible and headed for the checkout line, thinking about the custom paint job waiting back at the workshop. Jake was loading groceries into his truck when his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Bill, his neighbor who raised cattle on the property adjacent to the ranch. "Jake," Bill's voice was tight with anger. "You need to get home right now. There are people on your property and they ain't supposed to be there." Jake's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, people on my property?" "3 of them," Bill said. 2 men and a woman. "They drove right past your gate like they owned the place. I was checking my fence line and saw the whole thing. They're walking around your workshop right now, looking in windows and taking pictures." Jake was already climbing into his truck. "Did you recognize any of them?" The woman looked familiar. "I think she's that HOA president you told me about. Fancy business suit, gray hair pulled back tight, real uptight looking." "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Jake said, starting the engine. "If they're still there when I get home, we're calling the sheriff." The drive back to the ranch felt like the longest 20 minutes of Jake's life. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to leave marks, and he found himself pushing the speed limit on roads where he usually took his time. Nobody had the right to be on his property without permission, especially not people who were already making his life miserable with their constant harassment. As Jake turned onto the dirt road leading to his ranch, he could see a black SUV parked near his workshop. 3 people were standing near the building, and one of them was definitely taking pictures. Jake's security camera system would have recorded everything, but seeing it happen in real time made his blood boil. Jake parked his truck near the house and walked quickly toward the workshop. As he got closer, he could see that Bill had been right about the woman. Margaret Whitmore was standing in his driveway wearing another expensive business suit and holding a clipboard like she was conducting some kind of official inspection. The 2 men with her were obviously security guards. One was tall and thin with a radio clipped to his belt, while the other was shorter but built like a football player. Both were wearing uniforms with Willowbrook security patches on their shoulders. "Excuse me," Jake called out when he was still about 50 feet away. "What are you doing on my property?" Mrs. Whitmore looked up from her clipboard without any sign of embarrassment or concern. "Mr. Thompson, we're conducting a detailed assessment of the violations on your property. As I mentioned during our phone conversation yesterday, this is necessary to complete your violation report." Jake stopped walking and stared at her. "We didn't have any phone conversation yesterday, and you don't have permission to be on my land." "Of course we have permission," Mrs. Whitmore said dismissively. "This property is now part of the Willowbrook Estates community, which gives us the authority to inspect it for compliance with our covenants and restrictions." The larger security guard took a step forward. "Sir, we're conducting official HOA business. Please don't interfere with our work." Jake looked around his own property in disbelief. These people had driven past his locked gate, walked all over his land, and were now telling him not to interfere with their work on his own ranch. "This is private property," Jake said, his voice getting louder. "You're trespassing. I want you off my land right now." Mrs. Whitmore made a note on her clipboard. "Mr. Thompson, your hostile attitude is noted. We have the legal authority to inspect any property within our jurisdiction. If you continue to interfere, we'll be forced to call the sheriff and have you removed." Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. Have me removed? From my own property? The tall security guard was now taking pictures of Jake's workshop from different angles, including shots through the windows where several Iron Eagles members kept their motorcycles stored. Jake had given his brothers permission to use the space, but seeing a stranger photographing their bikes felt like a violation of their privacy and trust. "Stop taking pictures of the inside of my building," Jake demanded. Mrs. Whitmore looked up from her clipboard again. "We need to document all violations for our report. The unauthorized commercial use of this property includes storing vehicles belonging to non-residents." Jake walked closer to the security guards, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Those motorcycles belong to my friends. They have my permission to store them here." "Your permission is irrelevant," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "The HOA covenants clearly state that residential properties cannot be used for commercial vehicle storage. Each motorcycle represents a separate violation with separate fines." The shorter security guard had moved to stand between Jake and Mrs. Whitmore, his hand resting on the radio at his belt. "Sir, I need you to calm down and step back." Jake looked at the 3 trespassers on his property and felt something snap inside his chest. He'd spent 12 years in the Marines defending other people's freedom, and now he was being told he couldn't have friends store their motorcycles in his own workshop. "Get off my land," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "Right now." Mrs. Whitmore smiled that same cold smile he'd seen in her office. "Or what, Mr. Thompson? Are you threatening us?" Jake pulled out his phone and started dialing. "I'm calling the sheriff. We'll see who has the authority here." "Go ahead," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Sheriff Martinez is a personal friend of mine. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about your threats and aggressive behavior." Jake froze with his finger over the call button. Sheriff Martinez was Big Tom's cousin, but he was also an elected official who had to work with all the wealthy people in Willowbrook Estates. Jake wasn't sure whose side the sheriff would take in a dispute between a veteran with a small business and the HOA president with political connections. Mrs. Whitmore saw his hesitation and pressed her advantage. "That's what I thought. Now we have work to finish here. Please don't interfere any further." Jake stood in his own driveway, watching strangers photograph his property and make notes about violations he didn't even understand. The feeling of helplessness was worse than anything he'd experienced overseas. At least in combat, you knew who the enemy was and you could fight back. The tall security guard had moved around to the back of the workshop and was now taking pictures of the small apartment where visiting club members sometimes stayed overnight. Mrs. Whitmore was measuring distances between buildings and making more notes on her clipboard. Jake realized that calling the sheriff might not help, but he knew 15 people who definitely would. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Big Tom's number. "Tom," Jake said when his club president answered. "I need help. They're on my property right now, taking pictures and refusing to leave." "Who's on your property?" Tom's voice was immediately alert. "The HOA people. 3 of them. They drove past my gate and they're walking all over the ranch like they own it." "We'll be right there," Tom said without hesitation. "Don't do anything stupid until we arrive. Just keep an eye on them and document everything." Jake hung up and looked at the 3 trespassers who were still conducting their inspection of his property. In about 20 minutes, they were going to meet the Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club. Jake had a feeling they weren't going to enjoy the experience. The sound of Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried across the yard as she dictated notes to one of the security guards. Something about multiple commercial vehicles and unauthorized structures and immediate compliance requirements. Jake pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of his own. If these people wanted to document everything, he'd make sure to document them too. The tension in Jake's driveway was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Whitmore continued making notes on her clipboard, while her 2 security guards photographed every inch of his workshop. Jake stood about 20 feet away, his phone in his hand, documenting their every move while he waited for backup to arrive. "Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Whitmore called out without looking up from her paperwork, "we're going to need access to the interior of your workshop to complete our inspection. Please open the doors." Jake almost laughed. "You're kidding, right? You trespass on my property and now you want me to help you violate my privacy even more?" The shorter security guard, whose name tag read Davis, stepped forward with his chest puffed out. "Sir, this is official HOA business. We have the authority to inspect any structure on properties within our jurisdiction." "Show me the warrant," Jake shot back. "Show me any legal document that gives you the right to be here." Mrs. Whitmore finally looked up from her clipboard, her expression as cold as winter morning. "Mr. Thompson, when you purchased this property, you agreed to abide by all local ordinances and regulations. The municipal boundary expansion legally placed your property under HOA jurisdiction. We don't need a warrant to enforce our own community standards." Jake's hands were shaking with anger now. "I never agreed to anything. I bought this land specifically because it wasn't part of your HOA nightmare." "Your ignorance of the law doesn't change the law," Mrs. Whitmore replied smoothly. "The expansion was properly voted on and implemented through legal channels. Your property is now subject to the same covenants, conditions, and restrictions as every other residence in Willowbrook Estates." The tall security guard, whose radio kept crackling with static, had moved closer to the workshop's main door. "Ma'am, this door appears to be locked. Should I call for someone to open it?" Jake took several quick steps toward the guard. "Don't you dare touch that door. This is private property and you have no right to be here." Davis immediately moved to intercept Jake, his hand dropping to the pepper spray on his belt. "Sir, I need you to back off and stop interfering with our work." "Your work?" Jake's voice was getting louder. "Your work is trespassing on private property and harassing a veteran who just wants to be left alone." Mrs. Whitmore made another note on her clipboard. "Mr. Thompson, your aggressive behavior and refusal to cooperate will be included in our report. I strongly suggest you reconsider your attitude before this situation escalates further." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "My aggressive behavior? You people drove onto my land without permission. You're photographing my private property and now you're threatening me on my own ranch. And I'm the one being aggressive?" "We're simply doing our job," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Maintaining community standards benefits everyone, including you. Property values in this area are among the highest in the county precisely because we enforce these standards." "I don't care about your property values," Jake snapped. "I care about my right to live on my own land without harassment from people who think money gives them the right to control other people's lives." The tall guard had pulled out his phone and was taking more pictures of the workshop's exterior. Jake could see him trying to get shots through the small windows near the door, where some of the club's motorcycles were visible. "Stop photographing my friend's property," Jake demanded. "These motorcycles represent multiple violations," Mrs. Whitmore explained. "Commercial vehicle storage on residential property is strictly prohibited. Each bike will result in separate fines until they're removed." Jake felt like his head was going to explode. "Those aren't commercial vehicles. They're personal motorcycles that belong to my friends. They store them here because I have the space and they don't." "The distinction is irrelevant," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "Non-resident vehicle storage is a violation regardless of the stated purpose." Davis was now standing directly between Jake and Mrs. Whitmore, his hand still resting on his pepper spray. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down and give us some space to complete our work." Jake looked around his own property at the three people who were treating him like a criminal in his own home. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. He'd served his country, paid his taxes, bought his land fair and square, and now these people thought they could walk all over him because they had money and political connections. "You want me to calm down?" Jake's voice was rising again. "You people trespass on my property, photograph my private business, threaten my friends, and then tell me to calm down." Mrs. Whitmore looked up from her clipboard with that same infuriating smile. "Mr. Thompson, if you continue to interfere with our inspection, I'll be forced to call the sheriff and have you arrested for obstruction." "Arrested?" Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. "For standing on my own property?" "For interfering with official HOA business," Mrs. Whitmore clarified. "The sheriff takes our authority very seriously." Jake pulled out his phone again. "Fine. Let's call the sheriff right now and see what he has to say about people trespassing on private property." Mrs. Whitmore's smile got even colder. Go ahead, Mr. Thompson. Sheriff Martinez is a personal friend. We work together regularly on community safety issues. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about your threats and hostile behavior. Jake's finger hovered over the call button. Big Tom had mentioned that the sheriff was his cousin, but Jake wasn't sure if family loyalty would outweigh political pressure from the wealthy HOA crowd. Sheriff Martinez had to run for election every 4 years, and the people in Willowbrook Estates had a lot more money for campaign contributions than a motorcycle mechanic living on a ranch. That's what I thought, Mrs. Whitmore said when Jake hesitated. Now we have work to finish here. The sooner you cooperate, the sooner we can complete our assessment and leave. The tall guard had moved around to the side of the workshop and was trying to peer through another window. Jake watched him cup his hands against the glass, trying to get a better view of the motorcycles stored inside. Get away from those windows, Jake ordered. Davis stepped closer to Jake, his chest puffed out like a rooster ready for a fight. Sir, you need to step back and let us do our job. Your job is to harass innocent people? Jake shot back. Our job is to maintain community standards, Davis replied. Standards that protect property values for everyone in the area. Jake was about to respond when he heard the most beautiful sound in the world. In the distance, barely audible but definitely there, was the rumble of motorcycle engines. Multiple engines getting closer by the second. Mrs. Whitmore was still making notes on her clipboard, completely oblivious to the approaching sound. The 2 security guards were focused on Jake and their photography work. None of them realized that the situation was about to change dramatically. The rumble was getting louder now, the distinctive sound of Harley-Davidson engines echoing across the valley. Jake smiled for the first time since arriving home to find these people on his property. You know what? Jake said to Mrs. Whitmore. You're right. Let's get the sheriff out here. Let's get everyone out here. Let's make this a real community event. Mrs. Whitmore looked up from her clipboard with a puzzled expression. What are you talking about? The sound of the motorcycles was unmistakable now, a rolling thunder that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. Jake could see confusion starting to creep into the security guards' faces as they realized something was happening. My friends are coming, Jake said simply. The Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club, all 15 of them. They're very interested in meeting the people who think they can trespass on their brother's property. Mrs. Whitmore's confident expression faltered for the first time since Jake had arrived. What do you mean, 15 of them? The motorcycle engines were loud enough now that conversation was becoming difficult. Jake could see dust clouds rising from the road leading to his ranch as a convoy of bikes approached his gate. I mean, Jake said, raising his voice over the growing noise, you're about to meet some people who understand what property rights actually mean, and they're not nearly as polite as I've been. Davis and the tall guard were looking around nervously now, their hands moving toward their radios. Mrs. Whitmore was clutching her clipboard like a shield, her confident demeanor evaporating as the sound of the approaching motorcycles filled the air. Jake crossed his arms and smiled. The cavalry was almost here. The ground itself seemed to vibrate as the motorcycle engines grew louder. Jake had heard this sound hundreds of times before, but it had never been more welcome than it was right now. Mrs. Whitmore and her security guards were starting to look genuinely nervous as the rumble echoed off the workshop walls and filled the entire valley. What exactly is happening here? Mrs. Whitmore demanded, her voice losing some of its previous authority. Jake smiled and pointed toward his gate where dust clouds were now visible on the horizon. That's the Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club coming to check on their brother. 15 of the finest men you'll ever meet, assuming you treat them with respect. Davis reached for his radio. Ma'am, maybe we should call for backup. Backup for what? Jake asked. For standing on my own property with my friends? The first motorcycle came into view through Jake's gate, followed immediately by another, then another. Big Tom Martinez led the procession on his massive black Harley, his Iron Eagles patch clearly visible on the back of his leather vest. Behind him rode the rest of the club in tight formation, their engines creating a symphony of controlled power that made the air itself seem to pulse. Mrs. Whitmore took several steps backward toward her SUV. Mr. Thompson, if you're planning some kind of intimidation tactic, I should warn you that we have connections with law enforcement. No intimidation, Jake replied calmly. Just 15 American citizens exercising their right to visit a friend on his private property, which, unlike what you're doing, is completely legal. The motorcycles roared up Jake's driveway in perfect formation, their riders dismounting with military precision. Big Tom shut off his engine and removed his helmet, revealing the weathered face of a man who'd seen too much in his 55 years but still knew right from wrong. "Jake," Tom called out as he walked over. "These the folks who think they can trespass on your land?" "That's them," Jake confirmed. "Mrs. Whitmore here claims the HOA has the authority to inspect my property whenever they want." Tom looked at the three trespassers with the expression of a man sizing up potential threats. Behind him, 14 other Iron Eagles were dismounting their bikes and spreading out across the driveway. None of them said a word, but their presence was unmistakable. "Ma'am," Tom said politely to Mrs. Whitmore, "I'm Tom Martinez, president of the Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club. I understand you're having some kind of dispute with our brother Jake here." Mrs. Whitmore clutched her clipboard tighter and tried to regain her composure. "This is official HOA business. We're conducting a violation assessment of this property." Tom looked around Jake's ranch, taking in the neat buildings, the well-maintained fences, and the horses grazing peacefully in their pasture. "Violation assessment? What violations?" "This property is now part of the Willowbrook Estates community," Mrs. Whitmore explained, her voice not quite as steady as before. "We have the authority to ensure compliance with our covenants and restrictions. And you have permission to be here?" Tom asked. Mrs. Whitmore's pause was all the answer anyone needed. Davis, the shorter security guard, tried to step in. "Sir, we're conducting official business. We don't need permission." Tom smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Son, I was a police sergeant for 22 years before I retired. I know exactly what official business looks like, and I know what trespassing looks like too." The Iron Eagles had formed a loose semicircle around the three HOA representatives. Jake could see the names on some of the patches. Wrench Wilson, who taught high school math when he wasn't riding. Doc Peterson, who actually was a doctor and had saved more than one club member's life over the years. Legal Eagle Larry, who worked as a paralegal and knew more about the law than most attorneys. "Larry," Tom called out, "come over here and explain to these folks what trespassing means." Larry stepped forward, a thin man in his 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Ma'am, under state law, entering someone's property without permission is criminal trespass. The fact that you claim to have authority doesn't change that unless you can show a warrant or court order." Mrs. Whitmore's face was getting red. "We have municipal authority through the HOA expansion. This property is subject to our jurisdiction." "Do you have a court order?" Larry asked politely. "We don't need a court order," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "Do you have a search warrant?" "We don't need a warrant for HOA business." Larry nodded. "Then you're trespassing. I'd suggest you leave before someone calls the sheriff." Davis reached for his radio again. "Maybe we should call this in." "Good idea," said Doc Peterson, pulling out his cell phone. "Let's get Sheriff Martinez out here and sort this whole thing out." Mrs. Whitmore's expression changed when she heard the sheriff's name. "You know Sheriff Martinez?" "He's my cousin," Tom said casually. "Good man, very fair. Takes property rights seriously." Jake watched Mrs. Whitmore's confident facade crumble as she realized the political connections she'd been counting on might not work in her favor after all. The Iron Eagles weren't some gang of criminals she could intimidate with threats about law enforcement. They were respected members of the community with their own connections and their own understanding of how the law actually worked. "Look," Mrs. Whitmore said, trying a different approach. "We're just trying to maintain community standards. Surely you can understand the importance of property values." "I understand the importance of property rights," Tom replied. "And right now, you're violating Jake's property rights by being here without permission." Wrench Wilson, a massive man who looked like he could bench press a motorcycle, pointed at the security guard's cameras. "Been taking a lot of pictures, I see. Hope you got permission to photograph people's private property." The tall security guard, who hadn't said much during the whole confrontation, was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "We're just documenting violations for our report." "Whose report?" asked Legal Eagle Larry. "What authority does your organization have to create reports about private property?" Mrs. Whitmore tried to regain control of the situation. "The HOA has full authority over all properties within our expanded jurisdiction. The municipal boundary changes were legally implemented." "Show me the paperwork," Larry said simply. Mrs. Whitmore fumbled through her clipboard but couldn't produce any legal documents. The paperwork is back at our office. Then you have no proof of authority, Larry concluded. Which means you're just 3 people trespassing on private property. Jake had been watching this exchange with growing satisfaction. The Iron Eagles weren't doing anything threatening or illegal. They were just asking reasonable questions and pointing out obvious facts, but their presence had completely changed the dynamic of the confrontation. "Gentlemen," Mrs. Whitmore said, looking around at the circle of leather-clad bikers, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were simply trying to help Mr. Thompson understand his obligations under the new community standards." "By trespassing on his property?" Tom asked. "By conducting a necessary assessment," Mrs. Whitmore insisted. Doc Peterson stepped forward, his medical training evident in his calm, professional demeanor. "Ma'am, in my experience, when someone shows up at your home uninvited and starts taking pictures and making demands, most people would call that harassment." The security guards were exchanging nervous glances now. 15 bikers standing in a semicircle around them was apparently more pressure than they'd signed up for when they took jobs harassing homeowners for an HOA. "We should go," Davis muttered to Mrs. Whitmore. "We're not finished here," Mrs. Whitmore replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually," Tom said politely, "I think you're finished. This is private property and you don't have permission to be here. I'd suggest you leave before this becomes a legal matter." Mrs. Whitmore looked around at the Iron Eagles, at Jake standing with his arms crossed, at her 2 security guards who were clearly ready to retreat. For the first time since this whole mess started, she was facing people who weren't intimidated by her money or her political connections. "This isn't over," she said finally. "No, ma'am," Tom agreed. "It's not, but it's over for today." The 3 HOA representatives started walking toward their SUV, Mrs. Whitmore clutching her clipboard like it might protect her from the reality that her authority meant nothing on someone else's private property. Jake watched them go and felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't facing the HOA alone. Mrs. Whitmore and her security guards hadn't made it halfway to their SUV before the situation completely reversed itself. What had started as 3 officials intimidating 1 property owner had become 3 trespassers surrounded by 15 concerned citizens who knew exactly what their rights were. "Ma'am?" Big Tom called out as Mrs. Whitmore fumbled with her car keys. "Before you leave, I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." Mrs. Whitmore turned around reluctantly, her clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. "What do you mean?" Tom gestured to the security cameras mounted on Jake's workshop. "Those cameras have been recording everything since you arrived. We've got clear evidence of you trespassing on private property, taking unauthorized photographs, and making threats against the property owner." "We weren't making threats," Mrs. Whitmore protested. "We were simply explaining the consequences of non-compliance with community standards." Legal Eagle Larry stepped forward, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Actually, you threatened to have Mr. Thompson arrested for standing on his own property. You claimed authority you can't demonstrate. You photographed private property without permission. In legal terms, that's harassment and possibly stalking." Davis, the shorter security guard, was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Look, we were just doing our jobs. The HOA pays us to document violations." "The HOA pays you to trespass on private property?" Doc Peterson asked with genuine curiosity. "That's an interesting business model." Wrench Wilson, who had been quietly observing the exchange, pointed at the security guard's equipment. "Those cameras you've been using to photograph Jake's property. They've been photographing us too. Hope you got everyone's permission for that." The tall security guard looked down at his camera with dawning realization. "We were just documenting violations." "You were documenting people on private property without their consent," Larry corrected. "That's a whole different legal issue." Jake watched this exchange with growing amazement. The Iron Eagles weren't threatening anyone or doing anything aggressive. They were simply pointing out facts and asking reasonable questions. But the effect was dramatic. Mrs. Whitmore and her guards were clearly realizing that they'd walked into a situation they weren't prepared for. "Furthermore," Tom continued, "you've admitted that this wasn't your first visit to Jake's property. You've been conducting what you call assessments and inspections without the property owner's permission. That's a pattern of harassment." Mrs. Whitmore tried to regain some authority. The municipal boundary expansion gives us the legal right to ensure compliance with community standards. Show me the court order, Larry said again. I don't have it with me. Show me the warrant. We don't need a warrant? Show me any legal document that gives you the right to be on this property without permission. Mrs. Whitmore couldn't produce anything. Her clipboard contained violation notices and assessment forms, but nothing that demonstrated legal authority to trespass on private property. This is ridiculous, she said finally. We're trying to maintain property values for the entire community. By violating property rights? Tom asked. That's an interesting approach to community building. Doc Peterson had pulled out his cell phone and was scrolling through something. You know, I'm looking at the municipal code right now. Section 14.7 specifically states that property inspections require either a warrant, consent of the property owner, or immediate public safety concerns. Which of those applies here? Mrs. Whitmore didn't answer. I'm also seeing that criminal trespass in this county is a misdemeanor punishable by up to 90 days in jail and a $500 fine, Doc continued. Per incident. So if you've been doing this regularly. Davis was now openly nervous. Ma'am, maybe we should call the office and get clarification on our authority here. We have authority, Mrs. Whitmore insisted, but her voice had lost all conviction. Then demonstrate it, Tom said simply. Show us paperwork. Call your lawyer. Call the sheriff. Do something besides standing on private property making claims you can't support. The Iron Eagles had positioned themselves in a way that wasn't threatening but made it clear that Mrs. Whitmore and her guards weren't leaving until this situation was resolved. Jake noticed that several club members had their phones out, recording everything that was being said. You're recording us? Mrs. Whitmore asked when she noticed the phones. We're documenting a crime in progress, Larry explained. 3 people trespassing on private property and refusing to leave when asked. That's evidence. We're not trespassing, Mrs. Whitmore said weakly. Then you have permission to be here? Tom asked. We have authority. From who? The HOA. And the HOA's authority comes from where? Mrs. Whitmore couldn't answer that question either. Jake stepped forward for the first time since his brothers had arrived. You know what? Let's call the sheriff right now and sort this out. He pulled out his phone and started dialing. Mrs. Whitmore looked panicked. Wait, she said. That's not necessary. Oh, I think it is, Jake replied. You've been harassing me for weeks, trespassing on my property, making threats, and now you're refusing to leave when asked. I'd say it's definitely time to involve law enforcement. Davis grabbed Mrs. Whitmore's arm. Ma'am, we should go. Right now. But Legal Eagle Larry had stepped closer to the SUV, effectively blocking their path. Actually, I don't think you should leave until we get this sorted out. Fleeing the scene of a crime is another charge entirely. Crime? Mrs. Whitmore's voice had risen to almost a squeak. What crime? Trespassing, Larry said patiently. Criminal harassment. Possibly stalking, given the pattern of behavior. Unauthorized photography. Shall I continue? Tom had his own phone out now. You know what? Let's get my cousin out here. Sheriff Martinez needs to know what's happening in his county. No, Mrs. Whitmore said quickly. That's really not necessary. Why not? Tom asked. I thought you said he was a personal friend of yours. I'm sure he'd be interested to hear about your HOA authority. The security guards were now openly discussing leaving, their voices low but urgent. Mrs. Whitmore was looking around like a trapped animal, realizing that her usual tactics of intimidation and authority weren't working against people who actually knew their rights. Look, she said finally, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Perhaps we can work something out. Work what out? Jake asked. You trespassed on my property and refused to leave when asked. What exactly is there to work out? We could forget about some of the violations, Mrs. Whitmore offered desperately. You could forget about violations that don't exist on property you have no authority over? Tom asked. How generous of you. Doc Peterson was reading something else on his phone. I'm looking at the state statute on harassment now. Following or pursuing another person in or about a public or private place definitely applies here. So does engaging in a course of conduct that serves no legitimate purpose. Ma'am, I think you're in serious legal trouble. Mrs. Whitmore looked around at the 15 Iron Eagles surrounding her and seemed to realize for the first time that she was completely out of her depth. These weren't suburban homeowners who could be intimidated with threats about fines and legal action. These were men who understood the law, knew their rights, and weren't afraid to stand up for what was right. "We're leaving," she announced suddenly. "Not yet," Tom said firmly. "First, you're going to delete any photographs you took of this property and its contents." "We can't do that," Davis protested. "Those are part of our official documentation." "Those are photographs taken without permission on private property," Larry corrected. "Delete them now or we'll let the sheriff sort it out." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her security guards, at the Iron Eagles, at Jake standing with his arms crossed, and realized she had no choice. "Delete the photos," she told her guards. Davis and the tall guard reluctantly deleted the images from their cameras and phones, while the Iron Eagles watched to make sure they were thorough. "Now," Tom said, "you're going to promise that you'll never set foot on this property again without written permission from the owner." Mrs. Whitmore nodded quickly. "Say it out loud," Larry instructed. "For the record." "We promise we won't come onto this property again without written permission," Mrs. Whitmore said through gritted teeth. "And you're going to stop harassing Mr. Thompson with frivolous violation notices," Tom added. Mrs. Whitmore looked like she wanted to argue, but 15 bikers staring at her changed her mind. "Fine." Jake watched the 3 HOA representatives climb into their SUV and drive away much faster than they'd arrived. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe freely on his own property. Jake woke up the next morning feeling better than he had in weeks. The Iron Eagles had stayed for dinner, grilling burgers around the fire pit and sharing stories late into the evening. For the first time since the HOA harassment began, Jake felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. But Mrs. Whitmore apparently wasn't ready to give up. At 8 o'clock sharp, Jake's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson? This is Attorney Williams from the Willowbrook Estates Legal Department. We need to discuss yesterday's incident involving our assessment team." Jake put the call on speaker so he could record it. "You mean the incident where your people trespassed on my property?" "Our representatives were conducting legitimate HOA business," Williams replied smoothly. "However, they were intimidated and threatened by a group of motorcycle gang members. We're prepared to file charges for assault and intimidation." Jake laughed out loud. "Assault? Nobody touched your people. And intimidation?" They were asked polite questions about their authority to be on private property. Our security team felt threatened by the presence of 15 armed bikers. "Armed?" Jake's voice rose. "Nobody was armed. And they're not a gang. They're a motorcycle club full of teachers, mechanics, and small business owners. Half of them are military veterans." Attorney Williams wasn't backing down. "Mr. Thompson, we're prepared to offer you a settlement. Drop any claims about yesterday's incident and we'll reduce your outstanding violation fines to a manageable payment plan." "What outstanding fines?" Jake asked. "You people have no authority over my property. The municipal boundary expansion legally placed your property under HOA jurisdiction. Our assessment identified multiple serious violations that require immediate attention." Jake hung up the phone and immediately called Legal Eagle Larry. Within an hour, Larry was sitting at Jake's kitchen table with a laptop and a stack of legal documents. "They're trying to intimidate you," Larry said after reviewing the situation. "But they made some serious mistakes yesterday. Your security cameras recorded everything, right?" Jake nodded. "The whole thing from the moment they drove past my gate until they left." "Perfect. We've got clear evidence of criminal trespass, harassment, and attempted intimidation. And the fact that they're now threatening to file false charges just makes it worse." Larry spent the rest of the morning helping Jake file criminal complaints with the sheriff's office and prepare a civil lawsuit against the HOA. But it was Jake's decision to post the security footage on social media that really changed everything. The video showed Mrs. Whitmore and her security guards walking around Jake's property without permission, taking photographs, and refusing to leave when asked. It showed them claiming authority they couldn't demonstrate and making threats against a property owner standing on his own land. Most importantly, it showed the Iron Eagles arriving and politely but firmly explaining the law to people who thought money and position put them above it. Jake posted the video with a simple caption: "HOA officials trespassing on Veterans Ranch and refusing to leave until Motorcycle Club explains property rights to them." Within hours, the video had been shared hundreds of times. By evening, It had thousands of views and hundreds of comments from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Local news stations started calling, wanting to interview Jake about the incident. The first reporter to arrive was Jenny Martinez from Channel 7 News. She was professional and sympathetic, clearly understanding that this was a story about property rights rather than motorcycle gangs intimidating HOA officials.
"Can you walk me through what happened yesterday?"
Jenny asked as her cameraman filmed Jake standing in front of his workshop. Jake told the story simply and honestly. He'd bought property outside HOA jurisdiction specifically to avoid the problems he'd experienced in suburban developments. The HOA had expanded their boundaries without his knowledge or consent. They'd been harassing him with violation notices for things like owning motorcycles and having horses on his own land. When I came home yesterday and found them on my property taking pictures without permission, I called my friends for help, Jake explained. The Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club came to make sure nothing escalated beyond a simple trespassing situation. "Were you afraid the situation might turn violent?" Jenny asked. Jake shook his head. "The Iron Eagles are good people. Teachers, mechanics, veterans, they understand the law better than most lawyers I've met. They just asked polite questions and pointed out that taking pictures on private property without permission is illegal." The interview aired on the evening news with the headline, "Veterans' Property Rights Violated by HOA Officials." The story portrayed Jake as a hardworking small business owner being harassed by an overreaching homeowners association, and the Iron Eagles as concerned citizens who helped defuse a tense situation. But the real breakthrough came when civil rights attorney Rebecca Chen saw the news story and decided to take Jake's case pro bono. Chen specialized in property rights cases and had a reputation for taking on powerful organizations that tried to abuse their authority. She drove out to the ranch the next day and spent 3 hours reviewing Jake's situation. "This is worse than I thought," Chen said after examining all the documents. The municipal boundary expansion was pushed through without proper notification to affected property owners. The HOA has been making claims of authority they don't actually possess, and the pattern of harassment is clear and documented. Chen filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the HOA, Mrs. Whitmore personally, and the municipal officials who had approved the boundary expansion. The lawsuit claimed violations of Jake's constitutional rights, harassment, trespassing, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their property rights. The story continued to grow on social media. Jake's video had been viewed over 50,000 times and shared by property rights organizations across the country. People were calling it a perfect example of how ordinary citizens could stand up to bureaucratic bullying when they knew their rights and had good friends to support them. The Iron Eagles decided to organize a Ride for Property Rights to draw attention to HOA overreach and support Jake's legal fight. They put out the word through motorcycle clubs across 3 states, planning a peaceful demonstration at the entrance to Willowbrook Estates. On Saturday morning, Jake stood at his gate watching an incredible sight. Motorcycles were arriving from every direction. Their riders coming to support a brother they'd never met but whose fight they understood. By noon, over 200 bikers had gathered at the ranch. Big Tom addressed the crowd from the back of a pickup truck. "We're here today to support our brother Jake and to remind everyone that property rights are American rights. We're going to ride peacefully through town and gather at the Willowbrook Estates entrance for a legal demonstration." The ride was spectacular. 200 motorcycles in formation, riding slowly and legally through Cedar Valley while curious residents lined the streets to watch. American flags flew from many of the bikes, and the riders wore their club patches with pride. At Willowbrook Estates, the demonstration was peaceful and powerful. Bikers held signs reading "Property rights are civil rights" and "Stop HOA harassment." Local news crews covered the event, interviewing riders who shared their own stories of bureaucratic overreach and government abuse. Mrs. Whitmore was nowhere to be seen, but several Willowbrook residents came out to talk with the demonstrators. Many expressed support for Jake's fight, saying they were tired of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics and excessive fees. "I wish I had the courage to stand up to them like Jake did," one elderly resident told a reporter. "They fine us for everything. The color of our flowers, the height of our grass, the style of our mailbox. It's like living in a prison." The demonstration lasted 4 hours and ended without incident. But the message was clear. Americans still believed in property rights and they were willing to stand together to defend them. That evening, Jake received a call from Attorney Williams again. This time the tone was very different. "Mr. Thompson, given the recent publicity and the legal complications that have arisen, the HOA board would like to discuss a resolution to this matter." Jake smiled as he looked out at his workshop, where several Iron Eagles were working on their bikes and sharing stories around the fire pit. "I'm listening," he said. 6 months after the confrontation in his driveway, Jake stood in his workshop reading a document that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. The settlement agreement was 23 pages long, but the important parts were simple enough. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was paying him $150,000 in damages and legal fees, plus issuing a formal apology for violating his constitutional rights. Attorney Rebecca Chen sat at Jake's kitchen table, explaining the details of their victory. "The boundary expansion has been declared invalid by federal court. Your property is permanently exempt from any future HOA jurisdiction, and Mrs. Whitmore has resigned from the HOA board in disgrace." Jake shook his head in amazement. "I still can't believe we won." "You won because you stood up for what was right," Chen replied, "and because you had good friends who were willing to stand with you. The Iron Eagles' peaceful demonstration and the media attention it generated put enormous pressure on the HOA to settle rather than face a public trial. The legal victory was just the beginning of the changes that followed. The FBI had opened an investigation into the municipal boundary expansion after Chen's lawsuit revealed evidence of backroom deals and improper influence. 3 city council members had already resigned, and the district attorney was considering criminal charges for conspiracy and abuse of office. Jake's story had inspired property owners across the country to fight back against HOA overreach. He received dozens of emails and phone calls from people sharing their own horror stories and asking for advice. Many mentioned that seeing the Iron Eagles stand up for their brother had given them courage to organize their own resistance movements. The ranch had become an unofficial headquarters for property rights activism. Jake hosted monthly meetings for anyone dealing with HOA harassment, and Legal Eagle Larry often drove out to offer free legal advice to people who couldn't afford attorneys. The workshop had seen countless strategy sessions disguised as motorcycle maintenance, where frustrated homeowners learned about their rights while helping with paint jobs and engine work. Mrs. Whitmore's resignation had triggered a complete change in HOA leadership. The new board president was a retired teacher named Robert Kim, who believed in minimal interference and reasonable enforcement. One of his first acts was to eliminate most of the petty violations that had made life miserable for Willowbrook residents. Grass height, mailbox styles, flower colors. "These things don't affect property values," Kim told Jake during a friendly visit to the ranch. "What affects property values is creating a community where people actually want to live." The Iron Eagles continued their regular meetings at the ranch, but now they were joined by supporters from across the region. The club's charity work had expanded dramatically as their story spread. Their annual poker run now raised over $20,000 for local veteran services, and their volunteer work included everything from building wheelchair ramps to organizing food drives. Jake's custom motorcycle business had exploded after the media attention. He was booking paint jobs 6 months in advance and had hired 2 part-time helpers to keep up with demand. The irony wasn't lost on him that the HOA's attempt to shut down his inappropriate commercial activity had actually made him more successful than ever. The security camera footage that started everything had been viewed over 2 million times across various social media platforms. Jake regularly received messages from people saying the video had inspired them to research their own rights or stand up to bureaucratic bullying in their own communities. "You've become a symbol," Big Tom told Jake one evening as they sat around the fire pit watching the sunset. "Regular people are tired of being pushed around by bureaucrats who think they're above the law." Jake took a sip of his beer and looked around at his land. The horses were grazing peacefully in their pasture, the workshop was busy with friends working on their bikes, and the house felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever lived. "I just wanted to be left alone on my own property," Jake said. "I never intended to start a movement." "Sometimes the best movements start with ordinary people doing ordinary things," Doc Peterson added. "Standing up for what's right, helping their neighbors, refusing to be intimidated by bullies." The legal settlement had allowed Jake to make improvements he'd been dreaming about for years. He'd expanded the workshop, added a proper conference room for meetings, and built guest cabins for visiting club members and activists. The solar panel array now powered the entire property, and a new well ensured clean water for the horses and any future livestock. Jake had also established the Property Rights Defense Fund, using part of his settlement money to help other people fight similar legal battles. Rebecca Chen served as the fund's legal director, taking cases across the country where homeowners associations or government agencies were violating constitutional rights. The fund's first major case was helping a veteran in Texas whose HOA was trying to prevent him from flying an American flag. The second was supporting a single mother in Florida whose HOA wanted to fine her for having a vegetable garden in her backyard. In each case, the strategy was the same: stand firm on constitutional principles, document everything, and refuse to be intimidated by people who mistake authority for power. Local law enforcement had also changed their approach to HOA disputes. Sheriff Martinez, Big Tom's cousin, had issued new guidelines requiring his deputies to treat HOA complaints the same as any other civil dispute. No more automatic assumption that HOA officials had special authority, or that property owners were automatically in the wrong. Property rights are civil rights, Sheriff Martinez explained to his staff during a training session that Jake attended. Our job is to enforce the law, not to help private organizations harass citizens. Jake's relationship with his neighbors had also improved dramatically. Bill, the cattle rancher next door, had become a close friend and frequent visitor. Other nearby property owners regularly stopped by to share information about local issues and coordinate responses to any future bureaucratic overreach. The transformation extended beyond legal and political victories. Jake had found something he didn't even know he was looking for: a sense of purpose that went beyond his own property and business. Helping other people stand up for their rights had given him a mission that felt as important as anything he'd done in the Marines. Every month, Jake hosted what had become known as Property Rights Pizza Night at the ranch. Anyone dealing with HOA harassment or government overreach was welcome to come share their story, get advice, and connect with others facing similar challenges. The gatherings had grown from a handful of local residents to events that sometimes drew 50 or more people from across the state. This is what America is supposed to be about, Jake often told the groups. Neighbors helping neighbors, ordinary people standing up for what's right, and nobody being above the law just because they have money or a fancy title. As Jake looked out over his land on this particular evening, watching friends work on their motorcycles while the sun set behind his workshop, he realized that Mrs. Whitmore and the HOA had accidentally given him the greatest gift possible. Their attempt to take away his freedom had shown him how precious that freedom really was, and how many good people were willing to fight for it. The Iron Eagles had taught him that brotherhood meant more than just sharing hobbies or interests. It meant standing together when one of your own was under attack, knowing the law better than the people trying to abuse it, and never backing down from a fight when you knew you were right. Rex and Thunder snorted and stamped in their pasture, probably wondering why their evening oats were late. Jake smiled and walked toward the barn, thinking about how different his life had become since that first violation notice arrived in his mailbox. He'd set out to find a piece of land where he could live free from bureaucratic harassment. Instead, he'd discovered that freedom wasn't something you could find by running away from bullies. It was something you had to fight for, defend, and share with others who valued it as much as you did. The American dream, Jake had learned, wasn't about owning property or making money or being left alone. It was about standing up for what was right, helping your neighbors do the same, and making sure that regular people never forgot they had the power to hold their government accountable. As he filled the horses' feed buckets, Jake could hear the sound of motorcycle engines in the distance. More Iron Eagles were arriving for another evening around the fire pit, ready to share stories, solve problems, and remind each other that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood together. Jake finished feeding the horses and walked back toward the house, where the lights of his workshop glowed warm against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people asking for help, and new opportunities to defend the principles that made America worth fighting for. But tonight was for friends, cold beer, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes when good people refuse to back down, justice actually wins. Jake Thompson had found his piece of the American dream, and he'd learned that the best way to keep it was to help others find theirs too.